Conversations, episode 13. Welcome back or welcome in, whether you're a first-time listener or a returning listener. Very happy to have you either way, and we appreciate your support. Happy Thanksgiving week to those that celebrate. If you don't, it's still a really good week, I think, for sports. In fact, in my opinion, it's one of the best weeks of the entire calendar year as far as sports are concerned. Certainly if you're considering just collegiate sports. With Feast Week and Rivalry Week in college football and college basketball, I think that definitely takes the cake as one of the best college sports weeks that we have available to us on the calendar. So it got me to thinking a little bit earlier in the week, a question for all the shuckers out there. What is your favorite week of the year when it comes to sports? And it doesn't just have to be college sports. It could be anything. Something that came to mind for me outside of this week, of course, you've got March Madness, the first weekend of March Madness. Some people really love the Masters week. It's a whole week for some people. That would count. So I want to hear from you guys. Let me know, what is your favorite sports week of the calendar year? Let me know why, and shout it out in the comments. Wherever you guys listen, I'll take these into consideration, and at some point, I want to make a segment out of this. We'll maybe have a March Madness style bracket about the best sports weeks of the year and give some detail about those things, play them down to 2, and crown a champion best week of the year. Hopefully we'll have some interaction there from you guys on that as well. But just to begin, let me know what your favorite is. Shout them out in the comments. We're, of course, on all of the major streaming platforms for listening to podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. And then, of course, if you just want to shout us out on one of the socials, that works as well. We're on Facebook, X, at KBEX_ATC, Instagram, at cornversationspod. And, of course, if you want to leave us an email or send us a mailbag question for a future episode, you can do that as well. That's cornversationspod@gmail.com. And, of course, while you guys are doing that, if you haven't done so yet, a like, a follow, a subscribe, that all is very helpful as well. Make sure that you do that wherever you're listening or interacting. This week is not just big for college sports. We've got NFL games throughout the week as well to keep us interested, to keep us on the couch after some meals that we've had, if you do celebrate Thanksgiving traditionally. But I do want to focus mostly on the college sports today. I've got a few topics here that we'll discuss. A couple of them came from the mailbag, so I appreciate the listeners there. We'll cover those that came to us in the last week or so. But I do want to start with a conversation about Thanksgiving week and college sports in general, and whether or not it is becoming diluted to an extent. And I'm not really going to focus on college football here because I think rivalry week, especially this year, is actually pretty good. I don't really think you have any major headlines that would suggest that the rivalry week games on the slate this year are diluted in any way, and I think that's possible for that type of thing to happen, especially if you have two teams playing each other that have nothing to lose, for example, or really nothing to play for. So teams that are not playing for a playoff spot, teams that are not trying to ruin a team's opportunity of playing for a playoff spot, teams not with an opportunity to get into the postseason with a bowl game berth. You know, those types of things are what I think gives some level of urgency, some level of why to these teams when they're playing in these games at the end of the year. And I think in the past, the recent past, you could say, there have been some questions as to whether or not the rivalry games themselves have been diluted because none of those things exist for either team in certain matchups. But I think this year, most of them, you could say there is enough there where the soul of college football that we've talked about in previous episodes is intact with regards to these games. I mean, both teams want to win for whatever reason. They both are there. They're both mentally going to show up, and I think we're going to have good games as a result. So college football this year, I think, is safe from this conversation, but college basketball is the one I really want to focus on, and Feast Week has long been one of my favorite weeks of college basketball of the season because it has historically been an opportunity to sit down and watch some really good out-of-conference games that are played primarily on neutral sites, neutral courts, and a lot of this was thanks to the destination-style competitions that have been around in college basketball for decades. I'm, of course, talking about the Maui Invitational. I'm talking about the Battle for Atlantis. I'm talking, if we're talking about things that are no longer in existence, the Great Alaskan Shootout, the Paradise Jam down in the Bahamas. Lots of these opportunities for teams to go and play in destination areas. The opportunity to play really good out-of-conference competition that you might not schedule otherwise because it's just an opportunity to play in a tournament style where you don't know who you're going to be playing 2 days from the start of the tournament. But there has been a coup on Feast Week, if you want to call it that, with regards to where the best college basketball programs are deciding to play when it comes to this week and this opportunity to schedule some games out of conference that are going to be good resume boosters perhaps later in the season. And it really has been one tournament that has resulted in this flip, if you want to call it, from teams willing to pay their way to go to Hawaii, for example, for the Maui tournament and play these teams at the Lahaina Civic Center. And it's called the Players Era Tournament. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Players Era Tournament, effectively, here's how it works. You've got, as of this year, 18 teams. And they all ended up in Las Vegas. They've played in 2 different arenas. 10 teams played in one arena, 8 teams played in the other. And that's essentially how they were broken up. They were broken up into 2 pods, one of 8 teams and one of 10 teams. And it was round-robin style competition for the first couple of days of the tournament. And it established rankings, a standings, if you will, between those 2 pods. And when the round-robin competition was over, you took the top 2 teams from each pod, and that was your championship game. And you took the second 2 teams from each pod, and that was your third place game. And those 2 games were played on the 3rd day of competition. So in terms of the length, it was very similar to what we've seen from Maui, what we've seen from the Paradise Jam in the past, where you've got 3 days of competition, and it's basically playing down to, I'll say this in air quotes, the best 2 teams play for the championship. The wrinkle with the Players Era Championship is that the teams were decided to some extent by things outside of head-to-head competition. If multiple teams, for example, ended 2-0 in the round-robin style competition. And in those cases, the tiebreakers were things like margin of victory over the 2 games, total points scored, total points allowed, and if necessary, the AP rankings at the time the tournament started. So it was a little bit different there. You had an opportunity for teams who may have won both of their games to not be able to play in the championship game. So that's a little wonky in my opinion. But really the bigger issue here that I see is that a number of the teams playing in the Players Era Championship this year were originally scheduled to play in other tournaments. Maui, for example, Battle for Atlantis. And a number of these teams pulled out of those historically relevant tournaments during Feast Week. And the question is, why did they do that? Unfortunately, the answer is rather simple: money. The Players Era Championship has floated a very intriguing carrot to a number of these teams, which is that they are standing to make somewhere around $1 million per team for NIL purposes. So every single one of the teams, of the 18 teams who were in the Players Era Championship this year, is going to make $1 million from playing in this tournament. And when asked about this, there was an article that I saw earlier in the week, and Kelvin Sampson, the head coach of the Houston Cougars program, had expressed his doubts or his skepticism of how this was going to work. But when he met with the planners of the tournament, he realized that they had the backing of sponsorship, that they had the money, that this is a tournament that is put together or funded by private equity investors. And so the money really is there for them to do this. And last season was the first year for the Players Era Championship, and it was 8 teams. And those 8 teams were promptly paid out their guaranteed $1 million or so of NIL money. So there's a short but definite history of these teams getting paid. It's an opportunity that they're trying to grow. So it's 18 teams this year. It's planned to be 32 teams next year. And according to Kelvin Sampson, it's just an opportunity that you would be crazy to pass up, because when you think about what they've had to do in the past in order to get to places like Maui, it's been on the programs to do that. It's been an actual expense for those teams to show up in Hawaii to play in those tournaments. And in the end, really, what do you get out of it? The draw was always, well, you're going to have the opportunity to have exposure. People are going to be watching these games. It's an opportunity to play maybe better competition than you would normally in your out-of-conference schedule. But this Players Era Championship has really put a lot of pressure on these historically relevant Feast Week tournaments to do something different. And really, do something different means offer a competitive financial package for these teams to want to participate in your event over an event that is guaranteeing all of this already. Now, the problem that I see from a fan's perspective, from the perspective of, will this tournament actually result in more better watchability for the fan, is that these games feel stale compared to what we have come to know from places like the Maui Invitational, and really how we've viewed those tournaments from a hindsight perspective. You know, the Lahaina Civic Center is not a very big arena. It was typically filled to its max capacity, especially for the later games. And when we think about some of the best games in those tournaments, you know, they bring up some good memories. Now, is there the possibility that the Players Era Championship is going to eventually get to the same level where people are actively engaging in these games, they're watching them, they're attending them? That was one of the big issues that I saw, is that these are half-empty arenas in Las Vegas, so it does feel stale, not just from a watchability perspective if you're not there, but if you are there. And is there the possibility that this tournament could eventually gain some of the steam that the tournaments like the Maui Invitational have built over the years? Yes, I think there is. And if they keep putting enough money towards it, I think they could probably make that happen simply for those reasons. But it's something that I think college basketball has to really think hard about, whether they want to promote this type of thing or whether we could be seeing a situation where the only thing, in my opinion, that has drawn in casual eyeballs to college basketball prior to mid to late January are tournaments like the Maui Invitational. I had the thumbnail on a few episodes ago, and I asked him the question when college basketball was kicking off its first week of the season when he was on. I said, when do you start watching college basketball? And his answer back to me was, I don't really start watching it until March Madness is right around the corner. And I think for a casual college basketball fan, that is, generally speaking, the answer that you're going to get for most of them. However, I think historically there have been eyeballs on some of these games in late November that have been played in places like the Lahaina Civic Center or that were played out in Alaska. So you'd turn on a game at midnight and it would be in the middle of the first half. And if we start to lose that, do we start to lose some of what I think is the soul of college basketball, which is that you've got small arenas packed with people who really want to be there for, fun events in places like Maui? With all due respect to the Players Era Championship, yes, they can pay all of these teams and get them to come out, so you're going to have, in theory, the best competition, but is it going to feel like something that people want to watch? I really have my doubts about that unless something changes with regards to, number one, how they operate the tournament. I think that the style of getting two teams to a championship is a little bit gimmicky. But number two, I think they need to do something with regards to how the game feels. It can't be stale. It can't be something that feels very corporate. It has to be true to what has gotten people to watch college basketball early in the season. And Maui had it. I'm not sure whether or not the Players Era Championship does. But unfortunately, unless Maui and its collective of similar type tournaments does something different, they may fall by the wayside because they, frankly speaking, looked like second-rate tournaments this year compared to what the Players Era had in terms of the teams that were involved. So I, for one, hope that does change. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think that you might even need some private equity investment to get involved in order for this to change or for something to really challenge what the Players Era Championship is doing in terms of getting all of these teams to come and play in their tournament. We're going to go ahead and we're going to shift topics here slightly. We'll focus now on the mailbag. And the first mailbag question I got this week was an interesting one. It came from Trent. He said, I'm in Southwest Florida on vacation and just had breakfast with a Gators fan who was very disappointed in his school's football program and its performance as of recent. However, the Gators are poised to be very good at basketball this year. My friends seem frustrated that Florida can't be good in both. Additionally, the reverse can be said of Ohio State, and there are plenty of fans that still want a great basketball program to go alongside the great football program in Columbus. I wonder if in the new world of NIL and what seems like an untethered transfer portal for schools like OSU and Florida that have been good at both football and basketball, do they feel the need to spend more resources and basically specialize in one or the other? If it's not NIL related, what is it? Well, Trent, thanks for the question. I think that is a very complicated topic. And I will be honest, I spent some time looking at this question before I started the pod this week and tried to do a little bit of research as to what we were seeing in terms of what schools are actually spending and what they're making with their athletic programs. And none of what I was able to find was of any real surprise. I think what my ultimate conclusion was at this point is that you're basically looking at decisions being made by various athletic programs, and those are in alignment with what they feel like is their best opportunity to make money. So before I go too deeply into that, I'll just give you some indication as to what we're looking at here. So as far as expenses are concerned, when we talk about teams like Ohio State and the University of Florida, there is a fairly large gap between those two schools in terms of what they are spending on their athletic programs. Ohio State in 2023, based on the information that I was able to find from the Equity and Athletics data analysis, which is a preeminent source on this type of information, suggested that Ohio State spent more money in its athletic program than any other school in the country in 2023. And that grand total was somewhere around $260 million. $260 million. The University of Florida, meanwhile, spent somewhere around $180 million on its athletic programs. Now, what's interesting about this, I took a closer look at what that percentage of expenses in total was when you single out just college basketball or men's college basketball and football. And Ohio State is spending roughly 8% of its total expense on its men's basketball program. Meanwhile, its football program has an outsized share of 30% of those expenses. Florida is similar in that they are spending around 5% on its basketball program, its men's basketball program, and it's spending roughly 25% on its football program. Now, if you look at those numbers compared to what is driving the actual revenue for these universities, it's similar, but it's actually even more pronounced in terms of where the money is coming from. So for Ohio State, who, according to this data, made more money than every program in the country except for Texas, and that number was actually the same as what they were spending. So based on these numbers, Ohio State actually broke even in 2023. Around 9% of that revenue came from its men's basketball program, whereas around 43% of the revenue that they made for 2023 came from its football program. And at Florida, the numbers are actually even more skewed towards football. So it was 8% for its men's basketball program in terms of the percentage of revenue that the athletic program as a whole brought in. But 54% of the revenue from the University of Florida in 2023 for its athletic program came from the football program. So more than half of the revenue at Florida, and it's $180 million of revenue, came from the football program. And these are things like ticket sales, concessions, all the things that go into the game day aspect, apparel, right? And more than half is coming from its football program. So Trent's question then was, why can these programs not be good at both? And my answer to that is, it's not that they can't be good at both. There are a handful of programs, and Ohio State and Florida are arguably two of them that have the ability to do this. You're talking about high $100 to $200 million a year revenue and expense entities here. They have the ability to compete in both of these sports. It is a decision as a business, essentially, for them to focus their efforts on one or the other. So let's take a look at Ohio State, for example. They have an outsized share of their expenses and their revenues that are coming from the football program compared to the men's basketball program. In order to change that narrative, you're going to have to funnel more resources towards the basketball program. I talked about it earlier in this episode. Calvin Sampson basically said, it is about the money. You are not going to get the players in this era of college athletics unless you are offering them the money. And so you're going to have to put more towards the NIL collective. You're going to have to put more towards bringing in somebody who can actually recruit these guys and do things the correct way. And that's all going to cost the program money. But when you're only bringing in 9% of the revenue, it's a very difficult business case to make for those in the room that are advocating for Ohio State basketball to have a bigger piece of the pie here. And it is compounded by very delicate situations that exist that sometimes are out of the control of the people who are advocating for that money to go towards another sport. So, for example, Ohio State is paying off the severance package of Chris Holtmann, the former basketball coach there, and that does eat into the profit margin for that particular program. And so when you have a situation like a coach that doesn't work out, that you were paying a lot of money, and now you're paying his salary in addition to the current coach's salary, it makes it much more difficult to make the argument that you should be putting even more money towards that program when it is already taking a lot of money in the first place. And additionally to this, when you have the football advocates in that same room and they're saying, well, hey, wait a second, we need this amount more than we had the previous season in order to continue to have the success that we've had on the football field, ultimately they're going to have an outsized share of the decision-making power. Another way you can look at it is Ohio State looking at basketball becoming one of their focal points in the athletic program at the potential expense of the football program falling behind. Because when you look at Ohio State compared to Florida, for example, and you've got that $80 million gap in total revenues and total expenses, you can look at a program like Florida and you can say, well, wait a second. This is a program that is really good at basketball right now, and they seem to have a good head coach that's going to be around for a while in Todd Golden. But their football program is the one that's actually struggling, as opposed to Ohio State, it's the opposite. And you look at that gap in the total revenues, in total expenses, and you look at the fact that Florida is still making 50% of its revenue from its football program, and you say, okay, well, do you want to be that? If you're Ohio State, do you want to take the risk that you start falling behind when it comes to football? Because it's really difficult to catch back up, because you have a lot of these schools that are doing the same thing. Texas could do it. Alabama could do it. USC could do it. Notre Dame could do it. But you think about all those schools that I just named, and they all seem to be going towards football. Now, you look at another program, Kentucky, who's there in the top 20 in terms of its revenues, and they're looking at about 17% of their revenues coming from basketball. So there are certain programs that are going to look at this and they're going to say, well, no, we're known for basketball, so we're going to continue to push that. That's where we can compete. That's where we can make some of our revenues. And when you look at some other blue blood programs like North Carolina and Duke, it's a similar situation when it comes to basketball. The percentage of the revenues of their athletic departments has a much higher percentage than Ohio State and Florida, for example, coming from basketball. So the question then was, why can they not do both? I think the answer is that for a very small percentage of schools across the country, they could do both. But because it is a business decision, a business case that has to be made in the end, the voices that are advocating for basketball at programs like Ohio State, for example, are being drowned out by the football program. And practically speaking, it makes a lot of sense because people are going to go to the football games and they're going to expect a certain level of performance there. And if they don't get that level of performance, that has a much greater chance of affecting the revenues in a significant way than if the college basketball program at Ohio State is unable to meet the high level of performance that maybe some fans expect. But ultimately, a lot of those fans are still going to the basketball games. They just aren't bringing in as much money. And they got close. In the early 2010s, Ohio State got very close to being both a football and a basketball school at the same time. And if you're a college or if you're a basketball fan in Columbus, it was a great time for you. But those things are fleeting. The game has changed quite a bit since that time. And when you have situations like a firing of a head coach at a non-traditional basketball program, it's going to put that program back a number of years in terms of making yet another run of trying to be elite at that sport. So thanks for the question, Trent. I think that was a good topic there. It's one that I think probably deserves even more attention. I'd like to look into the numbers a little bit more and understand, where some of those things are coming from, because some of the numbers that I saw were different than the numbers that I had then double-checked and looked, at articles written about the fiscal policy and the fiscal strategy of Ohio State athletics, and they weren't one-to-one numbers. So it's the best that I have, but it may be something worth additional conversation, especially if somebody has information that they want to bring up that they feel like is in contradiction with what I just talked about. So the next and last mailbag question that we have for this week comes from Brennan, and he has two things, one of which I'm going to save for a future episode, but I will hit one of his other questions this episode. So he said, can we get your breakdown on the college football playoff with your reflection from the start of the year? And the second question is, does Dabo find a new job or even retire? So the first question that you asked, Brennan, about the college football playoff and my reflection versus the beginning of the year, I assume you mean my predictions for the college football playoff at the beginning of the year. We will touch on those in a couple of weeks when we're looking at the actual set college football playoff. And I'll do a rewind of what my picks looked like at the beginning of the season, and then we'll touch on those picks I made mid-season to see how each of them stacked up compared to what actually happened. I think it probably makes sense to do that in a couple of weeks. We've got a lot going on here with rivalry week and then championship weekend next week, of course. That's going to change the landscape, I think, potentially significantly in a way that the information that we would share this week would almost be obsolete in 2 weeks. So I'll share that in a couple of weeks, but I will hit on your question about Dabo Swinney and his potential to coach elsewhere if he decides to leave Clemson or if Clemson decides to part ways with him. Number one, I will say about Dabo Swinney, whether I think he's going to leave or not, I find it unlikely that Clemson would decide to part ways with him, primarily because of the buyout clause that he has, which is a $60 million buyout for 2025. And that is a situation that is going to be tough for any program to overcome. And unless he decides that he wants to go elsewhere, I don't see Dabo Swinney coaching anywhere else in college football, at least for the 2026 season. The other aspect of this, and I think this is something that maybe Dabo doesn't necessarily feel the same way, but I think that it would be difficult for other programs to not wonder about this, is that Dabo has taken a very unique approach when it comes to deciding to not utilize the transfer portal in the same way that some of the other programs that have risen quite significantly since the transfer portal rules have changed. And if I were another program and I were looking at Dabo Swinney as my next head coach, I would have my concerns about his inability to utilize the transfer portal. And some of the comments that he's made about the transfer portal, I think, drive that home for me. It's one thing if you can't get the players because they simply aren't going to go to your program because you don't have the money. But it's another thing to have the ability to get these players and to decide that that is not the philosophy that you want to employ. You know, Clemson is right there behind Florida in terms of the revenues that they make as a university with their athletic program. So the money is there for them to compete with the best in the country in the transfer portal as far as football is concerned. And if Dabo is deciding not to do that, I think that that would be a concern for pretty much any high-level program in college football that he might try to link up with if he were to leave Clemson. And so my thought on this is, if he does get let go by Clemson at any point, he might have a difficult time latching on with a new program that's going to allow him to have the same level of success that Clemson has had over the years, because there's going to be some concern, or at least there would be concern if I were an athletic department head, about bringing on a guy who seems to want to buck the trend of the transfer portal. You know, at some point, if you can't beat him, you've got to join him. And I wonder whether or not this is going to be the realization that Dabo comes to, and maybe we'll see some different strategies from him at Clemson in the coming years. But so far, he's really been resistant to it. He's been vocal about his resistance to it, and I think that does make him less of an attractive candidate when it comes to other big-time jobs in college football. Thanks for that question as well, Brennan. I appreciate that one. That's all I've got for this week. Hopefully you guys appreciated the topics. Hopefully you continue to have a good rest of your Thanksgiving week. You enjoy all that rivalry weekend has to offer in college football. And hopefully you'll be back with us for future episodes as well. Again, if you have not subscribed or liked any of our social media pages or the listening options that you have, make sure to go and subscribe and rate our show. That's really a big thing for us, and we appreciate it. And if you're going to be on the socials over the next weeks, keep on the lookout for some fun things from Conversations. We're going to be hopefully offering some opportunities for you guys to get some swag, some merch. So keep on the lookout for that. But until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.